Welcome back to another episode of the In No Hurry podcast. This is your host, Colt Douglas Claybourn. Excited to be back with another episode, a rare video episode for those of you that are watching this. But I'm joined this week by my wife, Emily. This is an episode we've been talking about doing for a few weeks now, and probably the episode that Emily is most excited to have ever done on this podcast. She's been here several times. We usually talk every year on our wedding anniversary, and she's been on a couple other episodes as well. But this week, we are talking all about books, and Emily's going to give you some book recommendations for this summer and some of her top reads of 2023. But first, Emily, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. This might be, as you said, my most anticipated show. I also may have bullied you into making me or letting me do this episode because I know you have a lot of authors on and you have a lot of other fantastic people who have a lot of wonderful things to say. But man, I don't know if you've ever had anybody on your podcast that has just come out to make some recommendations for people for things to read. So I just want to say I'm filling a void.
Yeah, this will be fun. Emily reads more than anybody that I know. And it's funny because we both read very different styles. I read mostly nonfiction, and Emily reads mostly fiction. So we balance each other out. But truly, this is her hobby. But I did take a break, a couple week break for the show. Emily and I were in Europe for a vacation at the end of May, and that was a belated 5-year wedding anniversary trip for us. Something that we had been talking about really since we got married, maybe even before that. And it was just a really, really special trip. We just got back a couple weeks ago, and I'm still missing eating gelato just about every day. But we went to Germany, Austria, France, and Switzerland. And for me, it was really special because we got to go to Switzerland where my grandmother was born and raised. She was born and raised in Zurich, and we stayed there for a few days. Also went to Lucerne, Switzerland, which is near the Alps. That was by far my favorite part of the trip. It was so beautiful. We had such good food, and I loved being in Zurich. What was your favorite part of the trip, or favorite parts of the trip?
Well, I want to say before we talk about the trip too, what made it really special was that I studied abroad in Austria the summer between my junior and senior year of college. And I met Cole, I met you like 4 days, I think, after I returned from that trip. And so that was a really formative time in my life. And so I have been wanting for 8 years to take you back or to take you at all because you had never been. And so it was just really special to be back in Europe again for me personally. And then, of course, for us to share that time together. But I definitely agree. Switzerland is amazing. I will always love Austria the most just because that's where I have spent the most time. And I climbed the Alps there and just had some really cool and special memories there. But Switzerland's a close second. And it was really cool to see the places that your grandmother lived.
Yeah, I think for me, like what was really cool about Switzerland was just like the vibe, which sounds super like Gen Z of me to say, but like everybody there just seemed to be chill. And it was just such a laid back atmosphere. Any place that I go that's by the water and there's mountains nearby, that's gonna be my favorite spot. Any place that I've gone, I love mountains and water. And Lucerne was beautiful. We get to take a boat trip out into Lake Lucerne and saw some snow-capped mountains, and there was like lush green grass at the bottom of it, and obviously the water. And that was kind of an old medieval town. And Zurich, obviously, a lot more modern in the sense that a lot of like modern companies have their banking operations there. It's kind of the banking capital of the world, I guess. But man, we ate so much gelato, had so much good food, and got to see some family over there as well. Emily's aunt and uncle live over there in Germany. And so just to see those different places, the only bad part was I think, a sinus infection, I guess is what it was, allergies, something in France that was just horrible. There is a funny picture of me on the internet, if you can find it, where I'm walking around France with a tissue box in my hand. That literally was what I had to do because I could not get my nose to stop running. So that was really the only downfall of the trip. And then on the way back home, traveling for being up for 24 hours and then missing the directions in Heathrow and ended up having to go through security again. So we actually went through security 3 times on the way back home. So that was not fun, but everything else was great. We really loved the trip. Emily got to go into a really cool bookstore in Munich that I'm sure she'll talk about. But I'm not kidding when I say I don't know anybody who loves reading more than Emily. She's wearing a sweatshirt that says bookish. And if there's one way that I could describe Emily, it would be bookish. I'm not quite sure what that definition is, but I would think that you would embody that.
It is someone who enjoys reading.
Okay, well,
So
that's you.
that is not inaccurate.
That's you.
Mhm.
Well, Emily, tell the listeners where you got your love for reading, because I know it was very early on. I mean, I just cannot emphasize enough. Like, you all have a hobby. Hopefully, you have something that you do. I hope that you all enjoy it as much as Emily enjoys reading. And how many books did you read last year in 2022?
135.
135. That's like a third of the year you were reading and finishing books. So
One every 3 days. Is that what
one
you're saying?
every 3 days. Some of y'all maybe have not read a book all year, and she read 135 last year. So that's pretty incredible. Well, I'm just saying, like, not everybody reads. Not that you have, not that reading has to be your hobby, but this is definitely your hobby, and you love it, and I love that for you. I like to read, just not nearly as much.
I like to watch sports, and I like to read.
Exactly. Yeah, and most of the books that I do like to read are sports books. I do read a lot of Christian nonfiction. Obviously, the authors that are on the show, I read a lot of their books and that style of writing. But you read a lot of fiction, and has that always been what you loved? And whenever you, I guess, tell us where you got in your love for reading, and what did it always start with fiction, or what was the origin?
Well, unfortunately, my parents weren't reading the encyclopedia to me as a child. So, yes, it did start with fiction. Some of my earliest memories really just involve my parents reading to me as a child. I remember, I mean, my earliest memories are about 3 and 4 years old. And I remember reading, we had this really big, thick blue book, and I'm sure my mom still has it. And if she doesn't have it, one of my cousins or aunts or uncles or somebody has it, because we know she can't get rid of anything. But it was a book of fairy tales, and of course, like, you had 3 little bears in there, and there was Rumpelstiltskin was the one I really remember, and just some of those, like, more classic fairy tales, and I remember her reading that to us when we were kids, and that was just, like, a really special part of the day for me growing up. And then I have other parts of, my life as a reader, obviously, when I learned to read. I think I was about 4 years old when I learned to read, and I learned to read by reading these little books. And for those of you guys who might know what these are, you'll get it, but they're called Bob books. And they were like these just like really short books, and they would have 3-letter words in them, like cat and dog and sit and hop and things like that, and I remember like learning to read that way. And I feel like, I mean, my mom can probably speak to this better than I can, but I feel like once I started reading, I never really stopped. It was just kind of something that was always a part of my life. It's always been something that's been a constant, even in seasons where, I haven't been able to read as voraciously as I would like to. I mean, when I think about my childhood and I think about formative moments for me, I think about reading. I think about when my mom would take us to the library. And it's really funny because my brother and I are total and complete opposites. Like, he never liked to read. He probably has not read a book since high school, which was what, like 12, 15 years ago for him. And so, I can't imagine even like a week going by without reading. But I'm sure she took us both to the library, but I just remember me going to the library, and she would have this blue basket. And I think it would just kind of like live in our car. And we'd go to the library, and I remember filling up that blue basket. And I remember thinking, like, okay, we have 2 weeks and we could check out books, and then they would be due in 2 weeks. And I would get like 5, 6 chapter books. And my mom's like, Emily, are you going to read all of these? And I remember thinking, like, oh my gosh, this is not enough time. I don't have time to read all of these. And so, like, I would still get all the books even if I didn't read all of them. But I just remember feeling like the library was such a magical place. And what's really funny about that is we live in my hometown. So, like, the library that I go to now is the same library that I went to as a child. And it's just so interesting how different it feels as an adult. It's still a great place. Don't get me wrong. I don't still use my blue basket when I go there, and I still don't get like 6 books for 2 weeks, because although I am an ambitious reader, I can't read that much. I don't know, maybe sometimes. But I just remember like having so much joy when I would have a break from school or if I finished my homework or if it was the weekend or summer break or something and I would just see how many books I could read.
Did this, like, whenever you were in school, did that ever impact your writing, like in English classes? Like, did you ever get creative ideas to where you
Mm.
wrote short stories, things like that? Like,
Don't even know this part of me. You don't even know this part of me. So this is really funny because I think I've always been a writer too, but I've never considered myself a writer in the way that you have because it's what you've done for a living. And you write in a way that is obviously journalistically motivated. But I remember spending hours of my childhood, more so like fourth, fifth grade. And I had a laptop, and I don't even think it was my laptop, to be honest. I think it was like a family laptop or something. And I would spend hours. This is such a weird thing. I remember I would sweat. My like body would sweat onto this laptop. This is so gross because I'd be writing so much. And I have no idea what happened to any of those stories.
oh man.
No idea what they were about. I'm sure they were excellent. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember writing fiction. I would enter these short story competitions that were at WKU and I would go and like present my little story and stuff like that. Again, have no idea what any of them were about. But I'm sure again, my mom probably has them somewhere. So my love of reading also was coupled with my love of writing, but I think I've always loved reading more.
Yeah, that's really cool. What kind of comfort did you get then, and maybe do you get now when you read a book? Because I know, like, you'll kind of just drift off for hours into a book, and you'll get so committed to finishing it. And there's some books that, like, you've literally come out of the bedroom in tears because they
Mhm.
meant so much to you or you enjoyed them so much. I think The Nightingale was one of them, if I recall. But there are some books that have really moved you. But just in terms of like reading in general, I mean, what kind of comfort does reading bring you, especially maybe in seasons where life is tough or you're just going through, various emotions?
So I'm going to go back to my childhood with that question again, because like when I think about reading, so much of the way that I read now was formed because of, the things I would read as a child. So unlike every other millennial ever, I'm not into fantasy and I'm not into Harry Potter. And I feel like as a reader, when I say things like that, people like look at me like I'm missing my head or something because it's like, oh my gosh, you didn't grow up reading Harry Potter. Because when I was in elementary school, I think I was in first grade when the first book came out, which would have been about 2000, 2001, maybe. And I remember they were like just the thing. And I mean, I personally feel like I was too young to read that at that time. I think what really was a disadvantage to me, which is ironic, was that my reading level was so high. So at like, I don't know, again, my mom would have to verify this. I would say I was probably at a 6 or 7 or 8th grade reading level in like second grade. So I would be trying to read books that were, I don't know, like 8th grade, ninth grade reading level when I was in third grade. And so the content would be so far and above what was probably appropriate for me. And I never really read like super inappropriate books, but I think that's kind of why I didn't read Harry Potter at that time because it felt too mature for me. And I'm almost 30 and I still haven't read them. So it almost feels like it's too late. But that's another conversation. So essentially, I didn't really get into the fantasy type stuff that a lot of other people my age did because a lot of my friends and a lot of the people that I know that love to read started reading Harry Potter, the Chronicles of Narnia, those types of books, Lord of the Rings books, those types of books when they were children. And that really cultivated their love of reading because they were these epic stories, like these really cool stories that you could visualize and see in your mind. And I didn't read those kind of stories, but I read others, and it felt like a movie to me. And I know that's so funny to say because they literally are like a movie. I mean, reading requires so much more creativity and more imagination than watching a TV show or a movie does. And I think that's why I like it more because you can imagine the characters, you can imagine the story, you can imagine the setting any way you want in your mind. And so that's why it becomes so cool because it's like, oh my gosh, I get to pick up this book and reconnect with these cool people in this awesome setting and try to figure out what's going to happen. And I remember as a kid, some of that looked like in like third and fourth grade, I read the Spiderwick Chronicles, which is hysterical because that is kind of like a little bit fantasy esque. But I just remember like immersing myself in these things. And I remember there was at one point, I was probably in like third grade, and I read for like 7 hours that day or something like that. And I was like, okay, this is like, I remember literally thinking, like, okay, this is, I'm into this. I like this. This doesn't feel like a chore. This feels like fun. And I think those of you all who are readers will understand that it's not something that feels like a chore, or at least it shouldn't. And I think that's a hard thing for people to understand who aren't readers because so much of the time we talk about reading, it's in this setting of school, like a school setting, and that feels like a chore. And I don't want that. I don't want that for people.
Yeah. It's funny because you mentioned it being, more imaginative whenever you read. And it feels like a lot of the movies that have come out recently have been based on novels.
Oh, everything is.
And there's even like TV shows that have been based on novels. So in your opinion, which ones have you seen in recent years have done the best job of adapting the book to the movie? Because I know there's a lot of times where readers go see a movie or a show and they're like, oh, that was nothing like the
Yeah.
book. And that can be disappointing. But I know we've seen some movies recently and TV shows too that have done a good job with it. So, in your opinion, which ones can you remember that have stood out to you that, hey, that was really close to the actual book?
So, don't come for me, guys. I didn't love Where the Crawdads Sing. I've read the book twice. I read the book for the first time in, I think, 2019 or 2020. And I enjoyed it. It's a very atmospheric read. It's about a girl who lives in a essentially a swamp in North Carolina. She is abandoned by her parents and she is considered like the swamp girl. She has to try to raise herself and she's an outcast. She's ostracized from her community. And so most of the book is just her thoughts, her trying to live in this environment. And but there's also a murder tied throughout, which was really interesting. But I enjoyed the book but didn't love it. The movie was really good. And so I thought they did that really well. So Hello Sunshine, which is Reese Witherspoon's production company, did Where the Crawdads Sing, and that came out in 2022. Cole and I saw it in theaters, and we both thought it was really, really good. I think I may have cried, honestly,
I think
and I
so.
did not cry in the book. The book is not emotional. Some people may cry, but I didn't cry in the book. And so I thought that was a really, really well done one. Um, I'm trying to think of other more recent things that I may have
We
watched.
saw A Man Called Otto, which is
Mhm.
based on a man called Uva. Yeah. What did you think of that movie? I haven't read the book, but I've seen the movie.
So I hate to say this again, I don't want to be a hater, but like I have such reservations with watching things that are books because the book's always better, in my opinion. So we did see that movie, and I was very, I don't know, I guess, apprehensive about Tom Hanks playing that role because the main character in the book is this very curmudgeon man who is extremely unhappy and depressed. So much so that he tries to kill himself multiple times in the book. And that sounds extremely morbid, but it's almost like a comical element to it because he continues to fail to do this. So essentially, he's grappling with grief and trying to figure out how to live his life without this person that has died. And I thought the movie handled it really well. Of course, since I had read it pretty recently prior to seeing the movie, there were a lot of details that they changed, most notably his name, most notably the location. And they changed a lot of things with some characters and things like that too. But the overall message was very similar. And I cried a lot. That one was very good. It was very emotional, and I did enjoy the movie. And I think sometimes you just kind of have to go into it knowing, like, yeah, they're going to change some details, and we have to be okay with that. And we just have to take it for what it is. And so I try to do that a lot of the time because, there are people who see it who aren't going to read the book, who don't care about the book, and are just there to understand and enjoy the story.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know you're a big fan of the show Firefly Lane, but that's apparently it's not anything like the book from what you said. Is that I don't know how you could forget about that because it's one of your favorites. So was that show any different than the book, or was it similar at all?
So should I go ahead and start talking about Kristen Hanna, or like do we need a whole other podcast for
Okay,
Kristen
so
Hanna?
up here, if you're watching on the video, somewhere, where is it?
Behind you. Section.
Okay,
This
so
whole section
right
right
above
here
my head,
to all. Oh my gosh, how can I not do this? This way, all these.
yeah, those are all Kristen Hanna books on the top of this bookshelf. So we have a bookshelf behind us in this room. Okay, we got
I can't do it.
it. But all of these are Kristen Hanna books. That is your favorite, one of your favorite authors. I don't know if that is the favorite of yours, but one of them for sure. But Firefly Lane, I'll let you take it away.
So Firefly Lane is a historical fiction book. And some people would say it's not historical fiction because it's like the 80s, the 90s, early 2000s, 70s. It chronicles like multiple decades. But basically it's a story of female friendship across generations, across decades, and pretty much has, I feel like, every theme you could ever need. You have found family, you have some romance, you have trauma, you have death, you have like sex and sexuality, you have drugs and addiction. I mean, there's so many things in it, but what I love about Kristen Hanna as an author, and most of you probably know her if you have heard of her from The Great Alone, The Nightingale, and then Firefly Lane is a little bit older. It's not too old, but she started writing in the early 1990s. So she has about like 30 books, something like that. I've read 14 of them. So I've not read all of her books, but I've read all of her most recent books and some of her backlog books. And what I love about her as an author is she is able to cross genres. She's able to cross um, just like different plots and themes and storylines in a way that is so unique, because so many authors just really stick with one thing. And I feel like she started off more of like which I didn't even know this was a genre till like this past year, but like a chick lit. So she's writing mostly to women. I know.
I would say,
Yeah, so it's just stories that we could probably just consider like contemporary general fiction, but more written about women and for women. Mostly her stories center on female protagonists and have some element of dysfunction within a relationship. So whether that's a friendship, mother-daughter relationship, husband and wife relationship, all those types of things, but it's always female characters. And she, of course, has male characters in there too. But I love a female character. And Firefly Lane was one of my favorites just because it covered such a wide range of time. The characters are incredible. And the story behind it is really like, if you read the author's note at the end, you'll understand why she wrote it, because a lot of it was based off of things that happened with her mom. But you're absolutely right. The show was so different. And normally I would be so mad about it. But what was interesting about it is, so I think Firefly Lane is 3 seasons. They just finished it on Netflix. So it's all out. Some people have very strong opinions about it. Some people are very pro show and some people are very pro book. I loved both personally. And I think you can love both. You just kind of have to go into it knowing that they're a little bit different. There's major plot lines that are different, but overall, it's about their friendship with Kate and Tully, and about forgiveness, about restoration, about healing, and about personal growth and identity. And I love it.
that's awesome. So when did it kind of take a turn for you in terms of like when reading became, I don't know, like you haven't always read 130 plus books in a
Right.
year. So like this new level of reading, and we'll get to kind of this new community you've found through your Instagram in a little bit. But when did that start? Like, when did you take this turn to where it's like a new level of finding a love for reading?
Well, I mean, I think you have to remember too that I was in school for 20 years. Is that about right? How many? I mean, I was in school, I mean, through high school, through college, and then went to grad school. So most of my reading, like if I did any sort of recreational reading, it was during summer break, winter break, fall and spring break. So I've always been reading, just not at the level that I had been the past few years because I had so much homework. Like grad school, I think the years when I was in grad school, I read like 8 books in that year. And that's simply because I was reading 500-page textbooks. So I was still reading. I was just reading about psychopathology and human and growth and development and things like that. I wasn't reading romances or thrillers or historical fiction to the degree that I am now. So if you're asking when the quantity really, really amped up, I would say 2018, 2019, because looking back prior to that, now I only have like recorded documentation of my reading 2016 to now. So for those of your listeners who are not readers or like don't know anything, I'm just going to kind of address you in that way so you can kind of understand what I'm talking about. So there is this program called Goodreads where you can track your reading. There are many other programs too, and I can talk about that too if you're interested. But I started using Goodreads in 2016. So I really only know how many books I've read per year since 2016. So, I mean, prior to that, I was reading for sure, but I have no idea like the quantity of how much I was reading before that because I didn't write it down. So, 2016 to now, I was pretty much averaging around like 40 to 50 books a year. So, again, reading more than the average. I think the average for most people is like less than 5 books a year, which, you know, is like what, one every 2, 3 months?
That's like 2 weeks worth for you, I feel like.
What, 5?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That'd be a dry spell. But yeah, so I mean, comparative to the average person, I've always read more than that. But to me, it's not really about how much I'm reading, just about like what I am reading and if I'm enjoying it. So definitely since 2016, it's picked up. But from 2016 to 2019, I was in grad school, so it was lower, you know. And then since 2019, it's been 50 or more a year. And then it's been definitely more since I started my book Instagram.
Yeah, that's awesome. Uh, just for the people that are listening, that like I know reading is not for everybody. Not everybody will want to read nearly as much as you or other people do. But I know one of the things you wanted to talk about was just like how to get into reading if this is something that you want to, and maybe even
Yeah.
just like some encouragement for people that maybe you're looking for a new hobby. I know like reading was one of those things you had to do in school, and I taught English for 5 years. I get it. It was always kind of a hard sell to some students to get into even books that I just feel like are super important. And even classic American literature, it was hard to get students to really get into that because you're competing with technology, you're competing with television shows, you're competing with their cell phones. So it is hard to get, especially young kids. I feel like to get when they get into teenage years, if they haven't developed a habit of reading, it's hard to get them into doing that. They kind of have to discover it on their own and decide they want to do it. But I don't know, what would be some suggestions that you would give to people on how to get into it?
Well, first off, I want to say that reading doesn't have to be your hobby. Like you can read, you can be a reader without being a reader. Like, I mean, I think you could probably say the same thing about watching sports. Like you can watch sports without that being like your entire life or your entire identity or anything like that. Like there are some people, and I know you know people like in your life where it's like, oh, I have all my sports memorabilia, or I'm always wearing a jersey, or I'm always going to games. Like I'm sure there's people that go to every single game that they for the team that they love. But just because you watch sports every now and then doesn't mean you don't like sports. So I feel like it's the same thing for reading. So like I said earlier, I don't think it's as much about how much you read. is like, are you reading? Like, is that something that you want to get into? And if the answer is yes, then you're a reader, and that's totally fine. You can read 5 books a year and be a reader. But what's really important to consider is just like, what do you enjoy? Because, if you were going to watch a show, you probably wouldn't want to watch a show within a genre that you didn't enjoy. Or you probably wouldn't want to watch documentaries if you hated documentaries, or you wouldn't want to watch a scary movie if you hated scary movies. I mean, I hate scary movies. So, like, I'm not going to spend time doing that. So, the number one piece of advice I would have for somebody who wants to read is to find a subject that you enjoy. So if you're like, oh, I really want to read horror books, go read horror books. That's great. I personally, like, I've read a few and I don't mind them, but I also like to sleep at night. So I don't want to, I don't want to read something that's going to terrify me to what be able to sleep. So when you think about what you enjoy watching or what you enjoy consuming, whether that be videos or, I mean, anything, because I mean, even if you're not reading books, like you might read an article, you might see something on the internet, might read into something and think, like, okay, like that was interesting. What do I want to learn more about? Because I mean, essentially, reading is learning. Whether you're reading fiction or nonfiction, you are learning. You are learning through somebody else's experience. You are learning about a subject that you may not have a lot of knowledge on. And you are expanding not only your imagination, but your knowledge. And I think that that's the coolest part of it. And especially if it's something that is interesting to you, it doesn't feel like you're learning. It doesn't feel like you're doing something that requires a lot of effort from you. It's something that can be enjoyable. So yeah, find something you find to be enjoyable.
Yeah, and I would even add to that, just from my perspective, I really like listening to books. And you can listen to an audiobook and that you're still consuming the book. And so a lot of the times my preferred way of reading is to actually listen to the book while I read it because I get so distracted whenever I read the physical book. But if I listen to it and then I can hear the person's voice and follow along, I just remember it better. And this is why I like nonfiction books because a lot of the time, the author who wrote that is the one who reads it. And there's something about reading an author's words in their own voice that is just really special. And so I really love whenever I have the opportunity to do that. And I'm really big into sports, especially baseball. And so I will listen to a lot of baseball books. Every summer, I try to find one good baseball book to listen to. And the good thing about those is they usually are written by journalists. And so they're in the style of writing that I already am familiar with and like. And they also are very explanatory and pretty long. And so it's something that I can really dig into. Like the one that I'm currently listening to is 13 hours long on audio. Now I have it sped up a little bit, so it'll probably be closer to 10, but that's like a long time that you get to invest and really be into it. And it's in a way, it's like watching kind of a multi-episode series because each chapter is about something new. So whether it's fiction, nonfiction, I don't know. I think listening to books, you can go on a walk and listen to it. You can be working out, cleaning the house, doing whatever, and listen to books. And I know that you listen to a lot of books too. What do you want to add about audiobooks?
Well, I think that's a really good point because um I personally have never heard this from anyone directly, and I'm very grateful because if you said this to me, I am going to hurt you. Listening to audiobooks is reading. Reading audiobooks is reading. And I have
Are you saying
had
people have said the opposite? Is that
yes,
okay?
there are people who truly believe that audiobooks are not a form of reading. And you're absolutely right. If you consume that information in any form, that is reading. And it's pretty it's honestly like, you know, ableist if we think otherwise, because essentially what we're saying is the if we're saying that the only form of reading is reading with your eyeballs, then we're excluding a vast majority of the population that that's something that they're not able to do. For example, my father is legally blind, so his only ability to consume books is through listening to audiobooks. And so I'm so grateful that we have that as an option, like Cole said, for those of us who might be doing things, and that might be an option, but also for people who that's their only way to be able to read. And so that's really important that we are able to access that. And my grandmother too, my grandmother has macular degeneration and she's losing her eyesight. And She honestly can't even really see her iPad to be able to use the audiobook, but that is something that she can consume and see in her mind in a way that she can't even really view the TV anymore. So, listening to books is her greatest form of entertainment in this season of her life, and I'm so happy to share that with her. Audiobooks have always been a passion of mine too. This is hysterical because I think back now and think about how far we've come, like, with this form of technology. Like, I remember getting CDs from the library. Actually, I think I honestly feel like remember getting cassettes. If I'm that old, I can't remember. Um, I mean, I remember having cassettes, but I can't remember if I had books on cassette. I know for sure we had CDs, and we would get them from the library. And I know some people who would get them Cracker
Yeah,
Barrel
I was
too.
about to
I
say
was like, hello,
Cracker
Cracker Barrel.
Barrel.
I
Books
think
on tape from Cracker Barrel
Oh, I
is an
mean, I
American
did books
tradition
on
in the
tape until
90s.
probably like no, I mean, I think I did books on tape till 20 I'm gonna say like 2013, to be honest, 2013, 2014, until I came upon all the various apps that we have. So I'm gonna give you guys like a little tiny snippet of information for those of you who might be interested in audiobooks because like Cole said, this is a really good way to be introduced to reading. And what I love hearing that people listen to audiobooks with their kids because I think that's a really awesome thing to do. Like if you're in the car or, if you're doing something around the house, like that's a great way for everybody to take in a story. But you can do this in so many different ways. I'm a mental health therapist for those of you guys who don't know, and I recommend books because yes, I do also read nonfiction. You keep saying I read fiction, but I do also read nonfiction. And I will recommend books to my clients relatively frequently. And most of the time when I read nonfiction, I do like to listen to them better. Now there are times where it is really nice to have the book if you want to highlight some stuff, if you want to, bookmark it, if you want to remember it for the future. But there is nothing like listening to a book in the narrator or in the author's voice and getting to hear from their perspective. And sometimes it's really cool, and I think this is the future, to be honest with you. I'm calling it now, is that audiobooks are going to be an immersive experience. We're seeing this more and more now. Like Malcolm Gladwell started this, and a lot of other authors that I've listened to have tried to make it more of a interactive experience. I know a lot of my fantasy reader friends, have loved A Court of Thorn and Roses, that book series. Um, and they're like graphic type novels. They're not graphic novels; they're actually really, really thick novels. But they have them in audio, and they're like you can hear the wind, and you can hear like the things in the background, and that's really, really cool. So I love when audiobooks do that. So there's lots of different ways to access audiobooks, and we have lots of options. I think that people just don't know the options. So when I talk to my clients about that, I'll be like, okay, if you have a library card, you have access to audiobooks. So there's hundreds of thousands of audiobooks, and it of course depends upon your library that you use. But the most common apps for that are going to be Libby and Hoopla. So Libby has audiobooks and ebooks, and that's mostly what I listen to on. You can get books from the library just like you would a normal book. And you can get ebooks that you can read on your Kindle or tablet in just the same way. And what's so amazing about that is like it's free, first off. I think that's great. It's accessible to everyone, which, is a great thing and shouldn't be a problem. But if for some reason, your library doesn't have a book that you want available, there are other apps that you can choose. Or if you're like, I just can't wait until this book becomes available, if it's already checked out. Um, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with Audible. Audible is owned by Amazon, and you can get a membership. Memberships vary from like $10 to $15 a month, and you can determine however many books you want to get in that period of time. It is a little bit more of a costly thing because you can't get like unlimited books. You can only get, I think ours is $15 for one book a month. And so for some people, that's just not in their budget, but it is something to consider. And then there is Scribd. Is that how you say it?
I
Scribd?
think Scrib.
Scribd. I have never used Scribd. What's your experience with Scribd, Ben?
It very brief. I didn't use it for very much. Most of the time, if I listen to a book, I use Audible. But to real quick, I was just thinking, I mean, you were talking about the audiobooks being immersive experiences. I noticed that recently when I listened to, it was a book called Adorning the Dark by Andrew Peterson. He's a musician, but really, in my opinion, is just a incredibly creative person all around. He has amazing artwork as well. But what was really cool about that was he's talking about his process of creating songs, and on the audiobook, where in the book he would be saying the lyrics, in the audiobook he's actually playing it with the guitar and singing it. And it was that really was a cool experience. And then just as an English teacher, there were certain books that, like, a lot of times I would play the audio for my classes because I knew that so many of my students would days off. They would, have their phone. They have the book up, but they have their phone there. They wouldn't really be reading. And I would try to vary it out to where we do some reading, but also listening. But I would play the audiobooks for some kids, especially ones that were really, really good. And some of them have really good productions, and like they'll have, music, and almost as if you're like watching it on a stage or watching it on a TV show where there's extra production to it.
Yeah.
It's not just somebody reading the words. There's, a lot more production to it. So some fiction books, and even nonfiction, but really with fiction, they do a really, really good job with it. So, but to answer your question, with Scrib, not a ton of experience. Most of the time I have used Libby, but the majority of the time it is through Audible.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure to cover all of them too for those who are interested. There's also one that I have enjoyed using, and it's called Libro FM. And what's really cool about that platform is it's about the same price as Audible. It's not owned by Amazon, and it's really focused on independent booksellers. So you can pick whatever bookstore you want, and a portion of your membership goes to support that local bookstore. So I think that's really cool, because we don't want literature to ever go away. Like, we don't want books to not be available
We
to
do not want
people.
to live in a Fahrenheit 451
Uh huh.
world
I know.
for many reasons, but
Yeah,
books being gone as one of them.
absolutely. Well, and I think, like, if we take away books, we take away individual freedom. If we take away books, we take away, I mean, this sounds really, what's the word? Like a hyperbole, I guess, in a sense. We take away the future. And I know that sounds like really dramatic.
The word you're
Um,
looking for was hyperbolic.
Hyperbolic, thank you. I should know words, you know. But I mean, honestly, I think it's so great that as technology continues to grow, we still are reading. We're still reading books. Like, we could be reading a book that came out 200 years ago on a piece of technology that didn't exist 15 years ago, and that's really cool that we can be listening to these things. We could be reading it on our tablets, or we could be reading a physical book. And I love all formats of books for different reasons. And so I just think it's really cool that we have those options, especially for people who prefer one method over the other. Like, all of these methods are still reading. So just because you don't read physical books, like you don't pick up a physical book, doesn't mean you're not a reader. Or just because you don't listen to audiobooks doesn't mean you're not a reader. Or just because you don't read on a tablet or something doesn't mean you're a reader. So what's really cool about reading in general is that we get to customize it and we get to make it whatever we want it to be.
Beautifully said. So I want to move on and talk about your reading Instagram that you have, and then also let you give some recommendations for books to read this summer, I guess, which will kind of double as some of your favorite books that you've read in 2023. But a couple years ago, Emily started an Instagram where she basically is devoted to rating and reviewing books. But I'll let you kind of describe the origin of that and how that came to be. And then it is, from my perspective, it has been a very fruitful and beneficial thing for you to network. You've met some really awesome people, and you could even talk about the trip you went on last year with some people. It has been a good community for you, and especially, the first couple of years that we lived here, we didn't know a lot of people. And I think, for me, like, this podcast was a good thing to talk to people. I think for you in the last couple of years, it's been good for you to meet other people that have a very similar, strong passion. And like, I play fantasy baseball. I talk with other people that are big into sports. So it's just good to have people to talk with that share the same interests. And I know you're in a book club here in town, but this is a little bit different. So just talk us through like the origin of this account. I guess first share with us your handle and then how this all came to be.
Okay, so I really hope there are some people who are listening to this that actually follow me on my book Instagram and are here to hear about the here to hear about this. I guess that's right. Because that just feels like a full circle moment to me. So obviously, I read a lot, and one might say I'm always reading. So my Instagram is M's always reading. So EMS always reading. And my name's Emily. So M is just a nickname. And that's what I shortened it to because I wanted it to be a derivative of my name so that people could remember, like, okay, this is a person and this is what's happening. Of course, Emily is a super common name. So I tried to come up with a handle that had my name that didn't have a bunch of letters or numbers or, weird things in it and was pretty easily recognizable. So I started my book Instagram in 2021, in the fall of 2021, at the encouragement of Cole. Actually, I had no idea Bookstagram was even a thing. Like, it wasn't something I followed, it wasn't something I knew existed. I've just always been talking about books. But the thing that stinks is that most of my friends in real life aren't avid readers. I mean, I have some friends that read occasionally, but I would talk about reading and it was like crickets, like it's like if you're really, really excited about something and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to tell this person about this thing. And they're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I mean, you read some, but obviously not like I do, not the same kind of books I do. And so I think part of the insistence may have been so that I could talk with books about other people rather than you, but that's, just putting that out
It
there.
wasn't that I didn't enjoy it. I just felt like I didn't have as much to offer you as I thought maybe others would. Like, I loved hearing about your books. I just, like you said, I don't read the same books. And so I just, it was kind of like a proverbial smile and nod. Like, yeah, like that's great. Like, happy for you. But it's like, I hadn't read it. And so I couldn't connect with you on that in the same way that, like, if we watch the same TV show, that's different. But like, I just thought maybe there's people out there that are reading the same things that would want to hear your takes on this too. And then you were putting book reviews on your personal account and you were kind of just like, do you think I'm bothering people? And I was like, I don't think you're bothering people. It's your own account. You can do whatever you want. But I was like, maybe because I toyed with that for a while where I would put, some stuff from this podcast on its own account. Not to the degree that you've done with your reading one, but yeah, it was just kind of this idea of like, the people in my personal life caring about this hobby of mine. That's always, I think, a risk that you run whenever you do anything creative or a hobby based and you try to share it. That's a whole other conversation for another day. Side note, support your friends and their hobbies, especially if they're
Yes.
creative, because they're going out on a limb to really share their work with you. So that's an aside, but nonetheless, I think it was a good choice for you, and I don't. I'll let you pick up from there, but I think yeah, it wasn't that I didn't want to hear about your books. I just didn't have as much to offer as I thought maybe others would.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, I'm grateful for that suggestion because, like I said, I didn't know it existed. So, like you mentioned, I was posting book reviews. Like every book I would read, I would, kind of just type up a little synopsis and post that to my Instagram story on my personal account. And some people would interact, most people did not, of course, because like not all of my followers or all the people that I followed read, which is totally fine. And so it felt like, okay, maybe there's this subsection of the internet that's into reading. Surprise. There's a huge section of the internet that's reading. Huge, like massive. I mean, they're not all following me, but like they exist. And I was so surprised. So like I, kind of thought about what I want my handle to be and thought about like kind of what I wanted for this page. And then I started it and then I started following accounts like, okay, well, I'll follow Read with Jenna and I'll follow Reese Witherspoon's book club and I'll follow those types of accounts. And then, maybe I'll follow some people. Maybe some other people are posting about this. And maybe other people talk about reading too. And then, of course, it's like, wow, how do I narrow this down? There's so many people that talk about this. There's so many people who read way more than I read. And who read different kinds of books that I read. And then there's a lot of people who read similarly to what I read, which is really cool. And I think that there's something to be said about finding your people. I think Drew Holcomb would agree with that. But He has a song called Find Your People. um, but I think there's something to be said about finding people who have a common interest with you. And I think we all need that. It doesn't just have to be a hobby. It could be with your career. It could be, your friends. It could be people that you're already doing life with already. But I think there's just something really cool about finding people who are like, oh my gosh, you know what that is. I know what that is too. And like being able to talk about that. And I think the best part of doing this has been meeting people. And so I've really, really enjoyed that.
Yeah, and it really took off. I know it was kind of slow at first. You were kind of discouraged. Like, I don't know, maybe there was a time or two where you were like weren't sure if you wanted to keep going with it. But then like you just started meeting people, and then you met some people that are somewhat local. And then last fall, you got to take a trip, and I'll let you describe
Yeah.
this. I don't want to take too much away from, but you got to take a trip and meet a lot of people in person. Um, and honestly, from my perspective, this was like the most well organized, well thought out event that I have ever heard. Like it was incredible. It was really thoughtful, and it seemed like you had a really good time. And we're really glad that you went. But yeah, just kind of share about that, how it started to really become more of a community for you, and then that trip as well.
Yeah. So I honestly thought that when I started this account, it was going to be like me and 20 people. I was like, oh, my mom's going to follow me and maybe some of her friends. And then maybe like, some of my friends who don't really care about reading. And then maybe some like grandmas on the internet that care about reading or something. And it's truly not about the numbers. Um, but like, I have been so pleasantly surprised by the people who follow me, and I've actually had instances in the past few months where people have come up to me like, "Are you Emily?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And they're like, "I follow your book Instagram." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, am I famous? Like, have I made it?" Um, and
That happened
honestly,
like what in Nashville, like happened in Nashville. She was at some kind of a pop-up event for Carly Jean Los Angeles, and somebody walked up and did they ask you by your, did they say, are you M's always
no,
reading?
she said Emily.
Okay.
Yeah,
That'd be awesome if they were like, are you M's always reading?
yeah. I am. But yeah, I mean, that also happened like here locally, which is even funnier because like I didn't expect people
Oh, that
locally
happened
to
at
find
Pilates
me.
class.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
happened at Pilates. Like I expected it to be more of like, because I mean, there's people from all over the world, that who have these accounts. So I expected it to be more like, oh, I'm never going to run into these people. Nobody's going to know me. I don't like post where I live or what I do or like all that kind of stuff. Um, but yeah, somebody in my Pilates class one day looked over at me and was like, "Are you Emily?" And I straight up thought she was going to be like, "Oh, I know your mom. I know your dad. Like my mom was a teacher." So I totally thought it was going to be a local connection. And she was like, "I follow your book Instagram." And I was like, "Oh my gosh." It's just, I think that is the coolest part, is just connecting with people, especially people that I wouldn't know otherwise. And I mean, that's really cool locally, but it's also cool to just meet people in a way that you would never otherwise. So what you had mentioned was I went on this reading retreat, which is hysterical to say because when I told people that, they were like, "So what are you going to do? Just like go somewhere and read for the whole weekend?" And I was like, "I mean, don't tempt me because that sounds like an excellent weekend." Um, but unfortunately, we actually didn't do that much reading. But it was, gosh, I think about like 12 of us, and we went and rented a house in Connecticut, which I'd never been to. Most of the girls that I went on this trip with lived in New England, so it wasn't as far of a trip for them. But yeah, like you mentioned, it was so well organized. It was so thoughtful. We got to go to a independent bookstore. We got to play a lot of fun, like bookish type games, and it was just really, really cool to meet people who you follow on the internet who were once strangers to you, and then to make that connection and to like bridge that gap from being strangers to being friends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was texting me while she was there, and like they even went so far as to like check with Emily about like dietary restrictions, and like made all these meals, and like had a chef there and like made these meals, and like I was kind of jealous. Like it was honestly like it was like better preparation than what I've heard most people have for like their bachelor or bachelorette party. And so it was pretty awesome, not gonna lie. Okay, so you have some books here in front of you, but it is the middle of June, and I know a lot of people maybe will be going on vacations, they'll be traveling, heading to the beach. heading elsewhere, maybe just hanging out, in your yard or in a hammock somewhere. But whatever you're going to be doing, finding a spot to read a book. Emily's got some suggestions for places to read those, or not necessarily places to read those, but books to read wherever you are, I should say. All that to say, summer book suggestions from Emily.
A very specific place. No, you can read wherever you want.
I would say that one of them needs to be read in a specific place. So
that is a again, what's the word?
Misnomer.
Misnomer, maybe. Yeah, because it's not quite what you think it is.
Yeah.
So I have 5 books in front of me, and I could go on with a million others, but I picked all these books because I loved all of these. Now, you mentioned summer reads, and I'm of the belief that anything can be a summer read because summer reads hit different. You can be on the beach reading, I don't know, about anatomy, and it would probably be more interesting than if you were in your home.
I think I'm just thinking summer reads because you mentioned like you were in school for a lot of your life. This is when you did a lot of reading.
Right.
There might be people that are in school or parents who like they're going on vacations with their kids. I don't know. Something about like the months of June and July feel like, even now that I'm out of education, it still feels like, oh, it's the summer break. And this is like when you do things that you don't normally do. So that's why I say like potentially summer reads and I don't know, hanging out by the pool more, hanging out in the lake, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I have a few of those, and then I have a few that are my top reads of 2023. So we're about halfway through the year. At this point, I've almost read 75 books. Stop. I'm planning to finish one tonight, and that'll be my 75th.
I've like started 75, haven't finished them.
Okay, it doesn't matter how many books you read. All it matters is that you're having fun. Okay, but the more I read, the more I become a little harsher on books. So anyway, I'll just preface it with that. So just because I'm not mentioning a book here doesn't mean I didn't love it. And just because I'm mentioning these doesn't mean that these are the only books that you could read or like anything like that.
For full reviews and exhaustive reviews, visit M's Always Reading on Instagram.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So first and foremost, I want to start with one of my favorites. This is a book I read, I think 2 or 3 years ago, and this is a perfect book for this time of year. You could read it at any time of year, honestly. But this is a romance. It's called Beach Read, and I'm sure like every person's heard of this book. If you haven't, go to Barnes and Noble. It'll be right there. And this is by Emily Henry.
Or your local independent bookstore.
Please go to your local independent bookstore. But for those of us who don't have one, go to your Barnes and Noble. So I got this copy for those of you guys who can see this on our trip in Switzerland. And so what I really am excited about is because a lot of books have different covers in the UK. So like in Europe, this is the UK version of Beach Read, which is such a pretty cover. And I plan to reread this summer because I read it a few years ago and I don't think I read it during the summer. So I'm really excited to read this one, hopefully on our beach trip. But this one is the misnomer because yes, it does take place on a beach. So it's not necessarily fully a misnomer, but it actually takes place on a lake in Michigan. So we're not thinking tropical. We're not thinking Florida. Again, you can read this wherever you want, but just go into this knowing that it's not like a tropical beachy type climate. So what's really awesome about this book is there's a lot of great themes in it, but it's a romance, but it's more of an emotional romance. I tend to enjoy emotional romances more than like a rom-com. Don't get me wrong. I love a good rom-com, but this one features 2 writers. So one is a writer of romance books and one is a serious literary fiction writer. And they're kind of like worst enemies toward each other. And essentially they go to write their next book and they both are experiencing writer's block. And so they're having a really hard time writing their next book. So they make an arrangement. I'm going to write a book in your genre and you're going to write a book in my genre. And we're going to see who writes the best book. And so the serious guy has to write this like romance book that he feels like is so silly and fluffy. And the girl has to write, I think if I remember correctly, he was like more of like a not F. Scott Fitzgerald, but just like a classic type author who takes things very seriously. And it's like, okay, if anything's outside of this genre, it's not good enough. So, of course, lots of fun happens in the pages, and they have to kind of get over their issues that they have with each other. It also explores like grief and all that kind of stuff. But it's really, really good. I loved it. I would recommend that to anyone. I had my mom read it and she loved it too. Another one of my favorites that I read in a day. And I usually like when I read a book in a day, it's usually a thriller or something really fast paced. And this one's a romance too. This is called Love and Other Words by Christina Lauren. And what I loved about this book is this felt like nostalgia in a book for me. And when I can read a book where I don't feel like I'm reading is the epitome of reading for me. Like it's just like this is the penultimate experience that I could ever have because it just feels like I'm having a good time.
Just want you to know, as an English teacher, that you used penultimate
Leave it
incorrectly.
alone.
Penultimate means the second to last,
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, what did I mean?
like the pinnacle moment.
Difficult. Thank you. Thank you. I told you I read a lot, but I don't know a lot of words. I'm honestly firmly of the belief that the more educated you are, the dumber that you become. So
I didn't say that to make you feel dumb. I just know that
don't
people
make
that
me
are people that are listening may have been like, "That's not what penultimate means."
okay, okay.
It's just it's in my innate nature to be
It's
like, "That's not what that means."
it's okay.
I'm that guy.
But honestly, I'll let you know too. If you have a Kindle, what's great about reading on a Kindle is you can click on a word and it'll tell you the definition of the word. So you'll use the word correctly from there on out because I've learned several words this week just from reading the book that I'm reading. But back to the book that I was describing. Love and Other Words is a second chance romance. It's a childhood romance where these two kids, Macy and Elliot, grow up near each other at this cabin and they are like
That's really weird. I
what?
played tennis growing up with a girl named Macy Elliott.
Oh, okay. Well, okay. Honestly, it says on the back here that he's a bookish friend.
Oh,
So that's probably why I liked it too. But they're just like childhood friends and they, spend their summers together. And then they fall in love as they get older. And this big thing happens that separates them. And years later, when she returns back to their hometown and they run into each other, they have to kind of navigate their relationship. And I'm doing a pretty poor job of describing it, but ultimately, this is probably my favorite romance of all time. Like I said, I read this in a day. And as I was reading it, I just truly felt like if I could write a romance, this is what I would write. If I could recommend one, this is what I would recommend to anyone. It's relatively clean. There's no like vulgar scenes or anything like that. And it's just a really good, comforting read. And I read this one in the pool last year. So you could totally read this on the beach or any fun summer setting. Okay. So then the next three that I want to talk about are different genres. And these are so far for 2023, I would say these are my top books.
I assume all five of these books were 5-star books for you.
I would say this one is a 4.5. I have some other 5-star reads that I could have talked about.
This one, you're pointing to one that you haven't talked about yet. Okay, yeah.
But I wanted to give people a little bit of a variety.
Okay,
I don't want to like only recommend one genre.
fair enough.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the next book is we could consider this a coming of age story or simply just general literary fiction. So this is a character driven story. It's called Adelaide. This came out just a few months ago. This is a debut novel that released in, I should be saying who the authors are. This is by Genevieve
You
Wheeler.
said the other one.
Okay, good. I was going to say, I keep forgetting that people can't see this. Or if you're listening, you can't see it. So Adelaide is a coming of age story, and it is a woman, an American girl who lives in London. And she's basically just trying to navigate her 20s. She deals with a lot of mental health struggles, and there's some heartbreak, there's loss, there's grief, there's death, and essentially a search for self identity and discovery amidst all these other things. So, yes, there is an element of romance, but this is not a romance. This is truly a self exploration, self discovery story. And as a person in her late 20s, entering her 30s, this book was so good because it's basically like, what does it mean to learn to be an adult? And how do I navigate these things, these really, really hard things? Not just like, how do I have a job and how do I, pay bills and that kind of thing, but just, how do I deal with depression? how do I deal with suicidal ideation? Like, what happens when I lose somebody I love? What happens when I have to make a really hard decision? I don't know how to make that decision. And is just so beautifully written. And so I have a feeling that this is, no matter how many more books I read for the rest of this year, this is going to be in the top. I actually listened to this one on audio, and as Cole can attest, I love to buy books that I listen on audio to have for my shelf because, I mean, again, if you can see this, this is a beautiful cover. He does the same thing. Don't even.
No, she also listens to books on audio at like breakneck speed.
No,
I don't know how she even hears them. They're so fast. It sounds like another language. Like I honestly, I don't know how she processes.
7.5 speed. I know people who listen at 3 times speed. So that's really not that big of a difference. But yes, everybody listens at different speeds, and that's okay. But I listened to this one on audio, and it was excellent. So if you need an audiobook recommendation, I would go with this one. And yeah, I mean, I couldn't get enough of it. So that is a one that I would recommend to most people. Now, again, be cautious. There are some trigger warnings in that. Like I mentioned, there is some suicidal ideation and there is some mental health stuff in there that if that is a concern to you, just proceed with caution. Okay, so the next book I want to talk about is a thriller, and this also released in 2023. It's called All the Dangerous Things by Stacey Willingham. And I got the pleasure of meeting Stacey a few months ago at one of my favorite local bookstores in Nashville. And let me see, and she signed it. And it was so cool to meet her because she has written 2 books. This is her second book, and they're both based in like the Savannah, Charleston area, which we love that area. So it's really fun to read her books. And what I also love about her books is that there's so much depth to them, and there's so many themes that you maybe wouldn't necessarily expect in a thriller. So this one is about a woman whose child is kidnapped. And again, want to pay attention to that trigger warning if that may be difficult for you if you have young children. But her child is kidnapped, and they have no idea where this child is. And so for the past year, she has been struggling with insomnia. She's up all hours of the night. She like literally hasn't slept in a year. So she's basically trying to navigate these questions of like, what actually happened? Am I so sleep deprived that like she's questioning, did I do something to this child? Did something happen with me knowing this? She doesn't really know. And there's some really interesting and psychological type elements in this book that I found to be really fascinating. This is a book that I'd recommend to pretty much everybody. It's not gruesome, it's not horror or anything like that. It's just a really good like domestic fast-paced thriller. And then the last one, we're going to have a lot of trigger warnings for because it is very disturbing. So I would say this is my favorite read of 2023. It's called The Last Housewife by Ashley Winstead. She is fantastic. I've read all of her books. She's another amazing author that can cross genres. She has 2 thrillers out and 2 romances out. And I'm always super, super, super impressed with authors that can write thrillers and romances because those feel like 2 opposite ends of the spectrum. So I am really into psychology, obviously, as a person within the mental health field. And this book, interestingly enough, is about a true crime podcast. So this woman finds out that this girl that she went to school with and that she was really close with died and was murdered while listening to a true crime podcast. And she starts to investigate this because she's thinking that something shady really happened. And so come to find out, this person, as well as other people, are a part of this cult. And there are some more graphic details in this book as nature of the cult's existence and things like that. It wasn't something I felt like I couldn't handle. And I have a relatively weak stomach and everything like that. It's not like, I don't know. So, but I just want to create that little warning for people in case they, don't like more dark or disturbing things. I loved it because I did not find it predictable. I found it to be engaging. I kept reading. I didn't want to stop reading. I really just kept wanting to find out what happened. And nothing has shocked me as much as this one did this year. So this is probably, I mean, again, I know we still have half the year left, but so far this is still my top read. And Adelaide would probably be a close second. So those are my 5 here that I'm going to recommend to people. And so we have some options of general fiction, thriller, and romance.
Well, great. Thank you for sharing your suggestions. Um, Thanks for coming on. This was fun.
This was so much fun.
Uh, Speaking of, just the final question that I always love to ask people, which I feel like I know the answer to this. Maybe you could ask something different or answer differently this time, but when you want to relax, what do you do? I wonder what you do to relax these days, Emily.
I don't have any hobbies, so it's tough. Um, Reading. Honestly, honestly reading, and I know that sounds lame after having this entire conversation, but there's something about escaping into a book, finding comfort in knowing that, like, you know what, I don't have to figure out what's happening here. I don't have to solve anyone's problems. I don't have to help anyone with anything. I can just see how the story unfolds. And I think that's my favorite part about reading, is that it doesn't demand anything of me. I just get to enjoy it.
That's a good answer. You've been getting into other stuff lately, though, like Pilates and
That's not how I slow down.
true, true. Yeah, true,
Not
true.
being in a hurry while you're reading.
Unless you're listening to it at like 3x speed, like
Well,
you
I don't
do,
do that.
so you listen to it pretty dang
Not that
fast.
fast. At half that speed.
There are times though where you're like, I've got to get through this book. I got through this
Well,
book.
it's because library. You gotta books too.
That's fair. Well, Emily, thank you for coming on to the show. Obviously, you live in the same house as me, so whenever you want to come on, I'm sure we can find a way to have you on the show. But nonetheless, it was fun to talk about reading. Fun to hear you. Like you can just hear the joy that you have about reading whenever you talk about it, and I think people that are listening to this will be able to tell that as well. So hopefully, if you're listening, you will go out check out these books. Definitely check out Emily's Instagram at M's Always Reading. I'll put that in the show notes. You can check that out down there. And yeah, give her a follow. Let her know that you heard her on the show because I know she would really appreciate that. And truly, like, it's not, like you said, it's not about the numbers. It's really just about like connecting with people. And so if you are an avid reader, there are a lot of people that you can follow that do very similar things to Emily, but I know the work that Emily puts in to really share the books that she read and the reviews, and she's very, very thoughtful. Like it's all genuine. Like she's super thoughtful about it and really takes time to be genuine with it. And there's a lot of stuff on social media that is not genuine, and I think it's just wholesome. Like it's wholesome, good content, and it's genuine. So if you're into reading at all, or if you're just looking for good book recommendations, Emily is obviously the go-to person in my opinion. So give her a follow. That's all I've got. Anything else?
Um, I think you should tell us your favorite book of 2023 so far.
It's a good question. The one that I'm currently reading, I am really enjoying it. It's called Winning Fixes Everything. I have not finished it yet. I'm about halfway through, but it is about the rise of the Houston Astros over the last decade, really. And those of you that are baseball fans are familiar. They were um, involved in a pretty egregious electronic sign stealing scandal years ago that led to a World Series title. Essentially, they were using technology to steal what the signs of what pitches were coming to them. So their hitters basically knew what pitch was coming. And when you have elite baseball players like that, they basically can take that information and hit a ball over the fence and get hits whenever they want to, just about. So they were essentially cheating. There's another book that's called Cheated that is about specifically that. That if you want to read more about that, but that book has been really good. But the best book of 2023 for me has been Atomic Habits. I read
Yeah.
that at the start of the year, and what was really good about that. Now I have not stuck to a lot of the things that I read in that book. I was in the process of establishing habits when I read that. And so I read it when I was going out on a walk every day. And that one is so dense. There's just a lot to that book that I almost would recommend reading it with it in your hand to take notes. I didn't do that. I did buy the physical copy so that I could go back and reread it. I listened to it and it was great, but there's so much to it. I mean, it is such a good book with just so much science and so much information that it's very easy to forget a lot of it if you're not actively paying attention to it. So, if you're in the mood to get started on habits, you're in the mood to maybe just change some things about the way that you're living, it's a great book to do that at the start of a season, whether that's like the start of a school year, the start of a new year, whatever that is. But you can really do it at any time, and he references it a lot in the book. He has a lot of extra resources that are downloadable. So whenever he mentions like a habit tracker, he has one that you can download if you want something like that. So it's a really interactive book that I think he understood that like this is a book that people are going to really try to use to change how they live. So it's a bestseller. You probably have seen it at Target, everywhere else. It's marketed like crazy. So it's probably a book everybody's heard of. But Atomic Habits, I finally got a chance to read it. Would definitely recommend that one. So all right. Well, thank you guys for listening. And Emily, thanks for joining me. And hope you guys find some time this week to relax and not be in a hurry. And we'll see you next time.
Happy reading.